This episode is dedicated to Rochelle Rose Bacharo, the transcript draftsperson for Breakfast in Beauclair, who recently passed away due to COVID-19. Thank you for your dedication and impact, which ensured that Breakfast in Beauclair is accessible for every member of our international community. The Hanza's hearts are with her family.
Are you talking to me specifically or Leah? Because I think she has more experience.
Oh, both of us. I mean, I'm happy to go first, Maddie, if you want to brainstorm for a minute.
I'm just trying to be polite because I feel like sometimes I talk too much.
Oh, same. So we'll just talk over each other and it'll be great. Like we're actually having coffee in a noisy cafe.
Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from GoodMorhen, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international hanza accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cirilla of Cintra, across the continent. Hey guys, guess what? You're invited to the Hanza's Summer Solstice Party. Join us this Saturday, June 26th, 2021 at 7 p.m. CET, 6 p.m. GMT, 1 p.m. EST, 10 a.m. PST, and 5 a.m. AEDT +1 on the Hanza Discord at bit.ly/the Hanza Discord. Meet other members of our international community and take part in fun activities celebrating this season. This episode, we welcome Hillary to our Hanza on Patreon. They join our producer-level patrons Louise of Covier, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Eric Sagodling, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B., Ava of Gullet, B. Haven of the Edge of the World, Charlotte from Vengerberg Glamorai, Red Kite, the Original Roach, Ariel Kitty, Dustin, Libby the Castel Ravello Smalier, Claire Odell, Gennady Mandilovich, Brett from California, Wolf, Corey from the US, John of Riblia, and Sebastian von Novigrad. If you'd like to explore becoming a patron of the show, head over to patreon.com/breakfastinbeauclair. As for this episode, Leah from the US and Maddie from the US call in for Blood of Elves, Chapter 4. Very important bits include, number 1, the endless struggle between factions on the continent, and number 2, plus introductions to abatement falconry and law, plot armor, fort exposition, and Geralt of Rivia and the less awkward thing. Just a note for this episode, I did continually pronounce Leah's name as Leia. Just for future reference, it is Leah. In our mid-episode news segment, Tidings from Toussaint, Larson Witcher Flicks shares major updates from Netflix's The Witcher Blood Origin, Nightmare of the Wolf, and the newly announced Witcher Con. Without further ado, let's begin our discussion of Blood of Elves Chapter 4. Welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair. My name is Alyssa, and I'm pleased to welcome 2 new guests to the show. My first guest is originally from North Carolina and now resides in Texas. She has a background in wildlife biology and digital cartography and currently works as an abatement falconer. She loves gardening, brewing kombucha, digital art, and anything to do with animals, science, or plants. You might also recognize her as the half-elf druid Saren from our America's D&D campaign. Super excited to welcome Maddie from the US. Hi, Maddie.
Hi, Alyssa. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Really stoked to have you here on the podcast. I know you've been an avid listener from very early on in season 1.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting to be here. I mean, I've listened to all of the episodes, and I remember when you first put out the trailer, was that 2017? How long ago was that? I don't know.
2019, yeah.
I remember, I had really gotten into podcasts because at the time I was working an office job that was definitely less exciting than what I'm doing now. And I was on my second reread of The Witcher, and I was like, there's gotta be a podcast. And I just searched, Witcher podcast, and your trailer came up, and I think, no joke, I listened to it, 5 times. And I was, so excited. I was like, I don't even know what this is, Holly, but, this is gonna be great. And then when you put out the call for guests and you called me asking to, get my application, I was like, what? Is this real life? This semi-famous person wants to talk to me. Oh my goodness.
I remember that call very well as well because it was so sweet. I remember that was the day that I think I had like 25 calls in one day.
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah, I
right.
think you had taken the call from your car or something. You were just like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I get to talk to you." I was like, "Oh my God." It was very sweet.
Yeah, because I had just like creeped on your Instagram and like liked everything, like sent you DMs, and then you were like, "Yeah, I'll talk to this creepy girl." Not that I'm actually creepy.
And now we play D&D together every week.
Oh, yes.
And my second guest is a New York-based attorney. She's previously an asylum lawyer, and she now works in trademark law. She loves words, languages, and storytelling, and has previously played a tiny warlock in her last D&D campaign. Please welcome Leia from the US.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
very excited. I haven't been a very active member of the Hanza, so I'm a total stranger to everybody. But I'm a huge geek for close reading and these books, so I'm stoked.
Yeah, well, more new friends for us. We love more friends.
Yeah.
So just so our listeners can get to know you both, do you mind telling us how you both got into the Witcher series?
I mean, I'm pretty much the basic Witcher fan when it comes to, I got into The Witcher with The Witcher 3 around 2016. I remember when it first came out, a bunch of people were like, "You should play this game. You love open world adventures." And I looked into it and I remember being like, "Oh, you can only play as a dude? That's kind of lame." And then I looked into it more and I was like, "Oh, wait, like that's why it's a dude, because it's like an established character." And I played it through. And then one of my roommates at the time was also really into the game, and he was like, "Maddie, did you know this is based on a book series?" And I was like, "Are you fucking kidding me? I love reading fantasy." And so I immediately like bought as many as I could, and on a college kid budget, and just like read through them. And I think listening to the audiobook series now, this is my third or fourth reread. I've reread some of the books more often than others, but yeah, I'm definitely like one of us now. I'm stuck in the universe. I'll never leave it behind.
Mine is pretty concise. I got into the Witcher series because of my sister, who you all probably know from the Hanza. My sister is Charlotte from Vengerberg Glamouri.
Yay! One of our favorites.
And so she started making these perfumes and creams, and the family was like, "Oh, what's this business you're doing?" And it's heavily inspired by The Witcher, obviously. And so I wanted to be supportive, and so I started reading the novels, and it turns out they're just super good.
Mhm.
So I've read all of them, and now we have this in common.
Yay!
I haven't played any of the games all the way through. I started one once, but I just but I have read the books.
Too busy lawyering.
If only. No, just too busy, I don't know, getting distracted by spots on the wall or whatever it is.
Nah.
Yeah, Charlotte was on the second episode. I think she was on the 10th. And then she's actually going to be, we're recording this on March 27th. And Charlotte is going to be on the next 3 episodes of the podcast. So
Oh, wow.
episode 31, 32, and 33, we've started to get into 3-parters.
Oh, wow.
For my mental health. So it's a very sexy reason.
Hey, man, that's important.
Hashtag self-care,
Yeah.
man. Yeah.
So we're going to start getting into 3-parters starting next week. But yeah, so I mean, outside of obviously The Witcher, I would love to hear more about each of your jobs just because they sound so interesting, and I'm getting like glimpses here and there of each of them. So Maddie, you're an abatement falconer, and all I hear from you is that you have a falcon, you drive around in a truck, and you chase off seagulls. Could you expand?
Yeah, so it's definitely fascinating. I, for one, did not even know this was a thing. When you met me, I was working an office job doing the GIS, the mapping stuff. And obviously, like, that was in my field, but it wasn't my passion. And then I was getting kind of like growing out of that position, and I started looking. And one of the main job boards in our field is the Texas A&M Wildlife Job Board. And I was scrolling through and I saw this thing that was like abatement falconer. And I was like, what? Because I remember going to falconry seminars during undergrad because, that's in the wildlife field. And being like, oh my God, I definitely want to get into this as an adult, but it takes a lot of time and money and like maybe when I'm retired. And then I saw this listing and I was like, this isn't real. This is too cool. And so I applied and got the job, and they trained me. And essentially what we do is, so there are many, many species of birds of prey that you can use in falconry. And what we do is not necessarily traditional falconry. So traditional is like you get your license, you pass the test, you trap a species from the wild, and then you have a sponsor who basically teaches you everything you need to know. And this intro into falconry was the same. Like I had to, like watch my sponsor and take the test and all of that. But because it's abatement and we're making money, we can't use wild caught specimens because that would be breaking like some of the wildlife laws in the country. And so they're all captive bred. And so they're Harris hawks, which is basically like a desert redtail. That's not the best comparison, but for people who know like a little bit about birds of prey, might make sense. They are the species that we use because they're actually gregarious in the wild. Like they hunt in groups as opposed to just by themselves. And because they hunt in groups in the wild, they're really easy and like kind of like the puppy dog personality of birds of prey. Like they're really tolerant of, beginners if you make a mistake, or like what we do, our job is we're not out there like hunting all of the seagulls. Our main goal is just to scare them away, to get across to the birds that this is not a safe place to eat. You should go somewhere else. And so we send the birds out. Sometimes they just chase them off. Sometimes they catch them. And the goal when they catch one is hopefully we can get to the bird and their catch in time that we can release the seagull with like minor feather loss, maybe like a scratch, but nothing that's going to be inhumane or like impede their success in the wild. And because of that, like most birds would not tolerate you taking their catch. They're like, what the heck? I just spent all this energy. This is my meal now. Like this is my catch. And so like there's a lot of very specific things you have to do to make sure you're not making your bird feel like you're ripping them off, like you're a bad hunting partner, because that's all falconry is just, it's not based on like love, like your dog would love you or a cat would love you. It's purely based on, is this human worth spending my time around? Are they providing me good hunting opportunities? Are they feeding me? Or are they competing with me and like getting in my way? So yeah. That's basically what I do, is work with birds and trash and all sorts of weird things.
Well, it's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I think, like you, I had no idea that was a job.
Yeah.
And it's really neat to hear about the different kinds of things that the Hanza does. And I think you bring that into D&D as well, which is really neat.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I play a druid, so that's probably exactly why.
Yeah. And Leia, could you tell us a little bit about trademark law, what you do in it, and anything that people might not really know, like anything surprising that the average person might not know about trademark law?
Sure. It's not nearly as cool as abatement falconry.
Yes, it is. Law is important.
But why is it important? Never mind. That's outside the scope of trademark law. Let's see, something interesting about trademark law. I think a lot of people have a very limited and like distorted sense of what it is and what it does.
Mm-hmm.
Trademarks are not, I hope that like not too many other trademark lawyers listen and will like get in my face about this, but like trademarks don't matter. Like they really don't. And like part of the thing, so I don't know how, probably people aren't particularly familiar with copyright either. But one of the basic things with copyright, right, is that like when you write something, it's yours. You don't have to do anything special. Like it belongs to you, like once you've made it, basically. The right attaches to you. Trademarks are similarly automatic, but they don't attach when you invent something. They attach when you are like selling something or offering a service, and a word or a phrase or a logo or whatever, or your name, becomes associated with that thing. So I think a lot of people believe that you have to register your trademark with the government or like file an application somewhere. Mm-hmm. And you can, but all that does is register it on a list. Okay. Like the trademark exists because you use it. Mm. And if you don't use it, it ceases to exist. It's very ephemeral.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of like weird poetic language that trademark lawyers use. because trademarks are also not very clearly defined. So we call it, this is a term of art. This is like a thing that we say specifically. It's a penumbra of rights, the trademark.
What a word.
And so there's this sort of like there's this shadowy kind of halo around your mark. And you can do things to expand or contract that penumbra. Usually, if you have a trademark, you want it to be wide, right? You want to cover as much rights as possible in this penumbra of rights. But it's very unclear, right? Like trademark law is very squishy. Like what makes a good trademark or a bad trademark or a strong trademark. It's all very like, I don't know. It's all very out there. But the short version is like, you don't need one. Like, or more to the point, if you have a product and you're selling it, you've already got one.
Interesting.
Like, it might not be very strong, but it's there. Like, so.
That's really interesting. But, so, like, people who start businesses, if they have an idea that's theirs, like, if they don't register the trademark or, copyright or whatever is the applicable term here, how are they protected from if somebody's like, oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to steal it, Like, I feel like that's a worry with people wanting to start businesses.
Oh, for sure. So like the issue with trademark is identity and confusion. Those are the two things that are important with it. And so it's less about stealing like if you decide you're also going to sell computers and you're going to call yours pear.
Oh my God.
Like, oh, that's a fruit. Right? Like I could maybe come for you, but it's less clear cut, right? Like I could say that maybe that's confusing, but the guys at the office, the trademark office who would decide this, might be like, that's not confusing. No one's going to confuse pears and apples, right? It's, so the stealing of the idea is less, right, like key than the issue of like causing confusion. In fact, trademark used to be, I'm not going to ramble about this too much, but trademark used to be localized, and it still is. So you can get a local trademark in the state that you live in the US.
Huh. Interesting.
And one thing that goes into the analysis of whether something is likely to cause confusion is whether you sell it like in the same marketplace. And like most things in law, it's like it's an idea that made more sense in like 1811 than it does now. Right? Because like, I mean, if you sell something on the internet, like where are you selling it? Right? Like these are things that like continue to be confusing to lawyers because we're parsing it through this like web of language that is all much older. And if you only sell things in one state, right, like back in 18 whatever, when you sold flour out of a cart and your sphere of business was just how far your horse could walk, then like, yeah, if some guy, in, Hawaii is selling flour and he has the same name as you, no one's going to get confused because no one's ever going to see them next to each other. So that's kind of why that still exists. It's like, yeah, you can have like a localized trademark.
And I think you had also mentioned, Leia, that in a previous life you were an asylum lawyer. I think that there's definitely an overlap between that kind of topic and jurisdiction and The Witcher as well.
Oh, yeah.
I know there's a specific point in this chapter that that we're going to get into it. But just very broadly, is there anything, I guess, about The Witcher that stood out to you in that phase of your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I was doing that work when I started reading these novels. And in case folks aren't super familiar, so asylum is a subset of immigration law. So people can come into the country, in this case the US, but a lot of countries have asylum laws. And it basically asks the government to be allowed to stay because they're afraid to go back to where they're from. And that process is asylum law. And so a lot of people who seek asylum are refugees and victims of various kinds of trauma. The most kind of classical scenario is war trauma. Mm-hmm. And so obviously the Witcher series treats with this very much throughout, I think, all of the books, or pretty much all of them. There's a war going on, at least one war going on. And you spend a lot of time in these books with regular people. Like you spend a lot of time with people who aren't soldiers and who like aren't politicians. And you really see the way that this turmoil affects them. And so that's definitely something that resonated with me, and that I really like about the books, and that I liked right away, was that it's very kind of authentic in depicting that. And both in like how grim it can be, and also in like how people are still very resilient. Like it doesn't veer into like pure like kind of grim dark like fantasy, right? Like there's definitely like funny moments and sweet moments.
Yeah.
But in particular, I did grant funded work, and the grant limited the people that I was working with. I was at a nonprofit, to unaccompanied minors, so I was working with children.
Aw.
And so Ciri being a kid, and being a survivor of this war trauma, like particularly is interesting to me, especially in this chapter. That's partly informed by that experience of like just having met a lot of kids who had been through a lot of difficult stuff at a young age.
Oh, wow.
That feels like a very natural segue into the chapter itself. So today we'll discuss Blood of Elves, Chapter 4, which follows Geralt, Triss, and Ciri as they leave Kaer Morhen and find themselves caught in the endless struggle between factions on the continent. As he does, Sapkowski opens this specific chapter with an interlude, and we get two contrasting fragments and quotes. The first one is from, I'm gonna ruin this name as I do them all. Oh, crap.
I was saying Hengedimdith.
Gedim. Okay, that I can roll with that. Roll with that. Okay. So the first one is from Hengedimdith. It's from a book called Elves and Humans, and the quote is, "Yet we already had names for everything which our eyes beheld in this new reborn world. Suddenly, in the far recesses of our memories, we found the words for dragons and griffins, mermaids and nymphs, sylphs and dryads once more. We named everything, and everything seemed close to our hearts, familiar to us, ours. Apart from them, they, although so resembling us, were alien, so very alien that, for a long time, we could find no word for their strangeness." And the alternate fragment here, or quote here, is just, "A good elf is a dead elf," from Marsh Milan Rapanek. What did you guys think of these opening quotes and how they frame the rest of the chapter?
I think these are so interesting. I want to give Maddie a chance to jump in, but I had written notes down specifically about this one. So I had said, and I think Alyssa had left a note here. So both of these quotes I think are from humans. Hengedimdith is a wizard. He's like really old, and he spent a lot of time I think with elves, but I'm pretty sure he's not one. And Marshall Raupanek is also a human. So it's really hard for me to read the first quote without thinking about the European arrival to the Americas, like the New World, right? And how there was this sense of like excitement and ownership that was like frustrated by, but not undone by the presence of like other people, which is kind of just amazing that like you could see that other people live there and yet somehow like that doesn't like totally put paid to your whole idea that like this is yours now. And I think there's a lot of that like parallel throughout the stories, right? Like the idea that sort of elves and these other non-humans are sort of indigenous, you know, and that the humans arrive at a more recent point, and are sort of colonizers.
As humans do.
Yeah. I think there's something that's really like cool and upsetting about the juxtaposition of these two, because they seem to be coming from very different places, but they both kind of acknowledge or at least assume like this sort of fundamental disconnect between like humans and non-humans. Hengedimdith especially, I think it's really interesting that like in his depiction of this, you know, like encountering real dragons was not nearly as confusing for people as encountering elves.
It does bring me back to, someone's going to like stop listening to the podcast for this, but it does bring me back to the book The Host, which was written by Stephanie Meyer, which is the same woman that wrote Twilight. So if you want to stop listening now because I have poor taste, go ahead. But I do remember in the book The Host, like the concept is about like aliens that have come to Earth and have taken over human bodies. There's a passage in that book from the mind of an alien. She's like, I can't tell anyone apart because they all have eyes and noses and they all look generally the same. But obviously to us, to humans, we all look very unique, right? So it almost feels like that concept that it's just slightly off I would imagine like for elves to have slightly smaller teeth, pointed ears, but still be compatible enough to create, half elves and procreation, but it's just slightly off, which is probably where that dissonance comes from. And I did actually look it up, and you were right. I completely forgot Jesus Christ. Hedgedimdith is a human, and just for people who haven't read further on the series, this is a character we'll only briefly see, so I hadn't remembered. But also, like, the way that the quote reads, and the fact that the name isn't like Marshall Milan Ropanek, like, it sounds very different. Hedgedimdith sounds totally different. I completely forgot about that character, so when I read this, I read it from the point of view of an elf. I thought that it was like an elf kind of waxing poetic about all the beauty of the world on the continent. Oh, and then all of a sudden there are these damn ugly humans. Like, I was reading it as if that thought was contrasted with a good elf as a dead elf from the opposite side. So I kind of had that like brain blast moment when you wrote in the notes this morning that like, oh no, they're both from humans. We can see that throughout like the last 500 or so years, the sentiment has always been the same between humans and elves, or at least for humans toward elves. It's just become a little more crass over those 500 years.
Yeah, you can definitely, I guess what I'm trying to say is like you can see how the first sentiment, although it's gentler, lays the groundwork for the second one. By just saying like there's just no way to bridge this gap between us. Or at least it felt that way. And maybe, I don't know, in the non-existent full text of elves and humans, maybe he goes on to say like, actually, we're very similar. But this is the pull quote, so this is what we have.
But yeah, Leah, what you were saying, obviously you seem to have more experience in this given your professional life. But when I read these quotes, especially the second one and the last part of the first one where it says they were so alien and, it was easier for them to conceive the idea of dragons than it was to conceive like a humanoid creature. Kind of makes me think of, I can't think of the name of the principle, but if you were to step out of your body and then see yourself, you wouldn't recognize yourself. It's some like psychological term. I forget what it is. It's kind of like the same idea, like, oh, that looks like me, but is it me? But is it not? They're just similar enough that it's kind of a mind fuck for them to understand, like, that's humanoid, but it's not a human. And then that kind of just leads to that greater tension.
Totally. Well, I think that actually gave me another thought, which is just that I wonder, because as I said about, this reminding me of the sort of like Columbian arrival into the Americas and like the accounts of that we have, which are all obviously from Europeans, similarly to how we have like quotes here from humans. It makes me wonder, because obviously in that situation, everyone involved was human. But there was still this deep sense of alienness and alienation. And I wonder like how much of this is actually just like cultural. We don't see a whole lot of like, kind of like everything is sort of filtered in these stories through the kind of contemporary framework within the story. There's like some stuff that's old history and some stuff that's not. But few people are around who remember everything firsthand. And so, yeah, you wonder like, oh, they're so alien. And it's possible that a lot of that was just behavioral, right? Or like, because, because it makes me think of this business with the Americas and like everyone involved was just as human as everyone else. And yet there was such a deep sense of like, otherness. And it only came from, like just language and sort of, nurture versus nature kind of thing.
Customs and all of that.
Yeah.
This interlude provides such a solid foundation for what happens next in the chapter. In the first section of the chapter, on their way from Kaer Morhen, Triss falls ill, and the Witcher, sorceress, and princess seek help at a fort, which had been attacked by a band of Scoia'tael in the night. So again, lays a lot of groundwork from the beginning. This chapter kind of feels like the short stories in The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny. We kind of learn a lot about what happens at the beginning, and then everything, comes full circle by the end. At the beginning, we find out that Triss has something. We don't exactly know what it is, but she has come down with some sort of illness that has left her incredibly weak, going to the bathroom, going to the woods quite a bit. And Geralt and Ciri are very, very worried. Maddie, you had something about the opening of this section?
Oh, yeah. So this is just the bird nerd in me. I love, and now that I say this, I hope the listeners notice more of it. Sapkowski uses bird imagery a lot. Like, Ciri's name means swallow. Later in the saga, some of the characters have, like, visions where they're seagulls above whatever they're witnessing. And I just think that this opening line is so perfect, how it says, "The misfortune behaved in the eternal manner of misfortunes and hawks. It hung over them for some while, waiting for an appropriate moment before it attacked." Of course, the falconer in me is like, oh, that's so great. Like, not only did he use bird symbolism, but he used it correctly. Because hawks are they're ambush predators. I'm sure if you've driven down a rural road, you've seen like a hawk sitting on a power pole, and what they're doing is just kind of waiting to see where their next meal is. Like higher vantage point. That's all I had to say about that. I just love when he uses imagery like that.
And I love that you can connect it to The Witcher with your job. It's great.
Yeah.
I love having experts on the show. It makes things fantastic. Yeah, when it comes to Triss's case is very interesting and a little bit, in my opinion, kind of odd and out of place. But hey, it's Sapkowski's writing. It's what happens every once in a while. She falls ill, and it's not explained what she has, why she has it. Geralt kind of asks her repeatedly, shouldn't you be immune to sickness as a sorceress? Triss never responds to it. She always ignores it. And Geralt is like, I'm not going to press it, which means Sapkowski doesn't have to write it. And it's like, when I read through the chapter and I also listened to Peter Kenny's version this morning. And when I did, I kind of sat there by the end of the chapter and I was like, what was the point of Triss being sick except for this entire chapter to happen?
Right.
And the fact that we never really get any in-world logic for why she's this anomaly kind of makes it feel like it's mostly just for the plot. But what did you guys think of this?
I think that's right. Like, it definitely serves the plot. And I don't think he ever comes back to it.
No.
And it's which is weird. Although I did say it's something that I like in general about how Sapkowski writes fantasy, is that like he doesn't have any problem like putting characters into these situations where they need help from other people. Mm-hmm. Even characters that like, you could easily imagine would need much less help, like a sorceress or a witcher. Yeah, it's like it's sort of implied that she might have some kind of dysentery, although luckily no one else gets sick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she doesn't. She's she's super evasive about it. He's weirdly cool with that. And
I don't know why,
but I do love that he's just sort of like, yeah, she's an enchantress. She has terrible diarrhea. Like, they're just gonna have to deal with this now.
Oh yeah.
Like, I appreciate that. But I agree. Yeah, there's not a lot of reason to it.
I was going to say it feels like a total Dungeon Master move to just be like, and scene, do the thing. Like, here's this weird scenario, deal with it.
Definitely. You're like, I cast heal on myself. It's like, it doesn't work.
You actually give yourself diarrhea.
Not one.
Right. Now you're more sick.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, this is infamously the Triss has diarrhea for the whole chapter. And I know that like for people who haven't read the book series and who are coming from like The Witcher 3 specifically, I think this might have come up on the show a few times, but maybe elsewhere because this is a spoiler-free show. So for everybody to kind of fawn head over heels over Triss in The Witcher 3, and then, people who've read the books have spent an entire chapter with her in which she has diarrhea, the whole chapter. And she's also trying to smack on her friends like on off again lover. The whole thing just reads as super, super strange.
It's so weird. Like,
yeah,
not trying to be too anti-Triss because she is an important character and I do appreciate her role in the series and everything.
Yes.
But obviously I'm Team Yen. it just really, really irks me how, like, in the previous chapters, and then this one of all chapters, for her to be trying to love up on Geralt, like, ooh, girl, like, he's carrying you to the woods to do some dirty business. Like, just appreciate the ride and, like, stop taking it for something else.
Totally. Yeah, I think one of the things that I do like about this is just that, like, all of the, like, superhumans in these stories are so messy.
Yes.
Like, and like Triss and Yennefer both are a disaster. But like, I appreciate that we also get to see that, like, this side of Triss, because we get to see a lot of Yennefer's messiness, and a lot of Geralt's messiness. But it turns out that, like, Triss, yeah, like, she's such a mess, and like her whole deal where, like, you know, and it really, like, brings up, I don't know, her messiness really sets off Geralt's messiness. Because previously, right, like, the whole reason that she's even there is because he really needs Yennefer's help, but he's like, I can't call her, it would be so awkward. And he decides the less awkward thing is to call, like, his one-time hookup who's been in love with him ever since.
Woof.
Like, I don't understand that logic. Like, why did you think this would be easier? You know, and so, like, of course she shows up, but she's like, I wonder what he wants. Maybe he's finally decided that I'm the one. And so I haven't played The Witcher 3. I don't have any, like, other notions about Triss, except that, like, she's just this schmuck who's, like, she's sort of hung up on, and I think she has a thing for Witchers. It comes up earlier in the book. Yeah, and it's just sort of like, dude, date another Witcher. They're all just there.
There's at least 3.
Yeah, there's at least 3. There's such a wide assortment. But yeah, she's such a mess. And I did mention in a note here, so I am also, like, a big geek for fantasy novels, and she reminds me in this of another witch in another book. The book is Dark Lord of Dirkholm by Diana Wynne Jones, and the witch is named Querida. And Querida, much like Triss, is a very powerful witch. And much like Triss, she just cannot deal with being sick or, like, with injury. And, like, she responds to it in, like, the most dramatic, over the top way. And it like frustrates everyone around her. But people who know Querida, and we never get to really meet anyone else who knows Triss, but I imagine it would be similar, right? They're just like, oh, she just gets like this. Like, I don't know, she just can't deal with being sick. It, like, throws off her whole worldview. And so, like, I appreciate that, because it does seem like a realistic side effect of being, like, a super powerful wizard. Is that, like, when you get a stomach bug, you're just, like, super over the top about it, because like, you're just, like, you're so angry at the world that you just, like, can't just get bed rest like a normal person.
Going back to what you had opened with, Leia, it's like it does make them more human and more realistic, that they're superhuman, but they also have these very trite issues that just, in the grand scheme of things, like, maybe they don't really matter, but, like, they're equally as human as everyone else. They have the same apparently physical ailments that other humans may have. Just they might be a little bit more equipped to handle it in most cases, with Triss seemingly being the one exception.
Right.
I do like how it's, so the term plot armor comes to mind. George R.R. Martin does not have plot armor for any of his characters. Sapkowski kind of does, but it's kind of nice, like you said, that all of these superhuman people, like, they don't have plot armor when it comes to normal human inconveniences. But Geralt just being chill with it, it really did make me, you know, maybe this is later in the chapter, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but somebody thinks it's ironic that, you know, he brings out these magical medicaments and all of these things, and she's like, no, I'm allergic, I'm sensitized. It just makes me wonder, you know, like, in the books, not comparing to the show, because that kind of muddles things, like Brett said in an earlier episode. But it brings to mind the sorcerers and sorceresses seem to have some sort of transformation, or maybe it's just that they're using magic, that it slowly transforms their bodies, and most times makes them infertile. It's just really interesting. Like, what about Triss makes it so that she can get sick, and also she can't use magical healing things unless it's an amulet? That really kind of stumped me.
Yeah. I feel like Triss would do super well in the current day and age where everybody loves gemstones. Totally. The whole world's about crystals.
Well, I also like that part of this issue isn't just that, like, she's sick and she can't magically heal herself. It's that she forgot her amulet.
Yeah.
Like, it's not even, like, and it's just like, wait, can you not, like, summon it or something? But, like, no, because she's sick, so now she can't. You know, it turns out that there's, like, a lot of, you know, you have to like dot your I's and cross your T's when you're doing magic. And like,
Yeah.
turns out, no, just the easy solution isn't accessible. So they're stuck like begging for help from a fort full of guys.
Hence the plot, right?
Hence the plot, exactly. Off to Fort Exposition.
Oh my God, that's the perfect way of phrasing that. Yeah. Before we arrive at Fort Exposition, we're going to hand it over to Lars Mutterflix for recent news on the Netflix show. When we come back, Leah, Maddie, and I will continue our discussion of Blood of Elves Chapter 4.
Hey, it's Lars from Witcherflix, and this is Tidings from Toussaint. Welcome back, everybody. Netflix Geek Week delivered, and since then 2 short teasers for Season 2 were released. One for Ciri and one for Geralt. You don't need to be the elven prophet Ithleen to guess that at least one more teaser, this time for Yennefer, will be released in the very near future. Go to breakfastandbeauclair.com to take a look for yourself. But now let's jump right into the teasers. The first one, released on the final day of Netflix Geek Week, starred our Lion Cup of Cintra, Ciri. The teaser is a very fast sequence of some interesting shots. These scenes include a very curious Witcher sword with elven runes, similar to those from the video game The Witcher 3, a close-up of the hands of the elven sorceress Francesca Finderbear, played by Misia Simpson, and several extensive scenes of Ciri training at GoodMorhen. The second teaser is about Geralt. It is another very fast sequence and has some very special things in store for us. In this teaser we have our first look at GoodMorhen, the Witcher fortress, as well as some blurry images of Vesemir and a very dimly lit interior of a spooky mansion that book readers know from the short story A Grain of Truth. I can't wait to see what Yennefer's trailer will show us. In other Witcher news, Netflix not only announced an official online shop selling exclusive limited edition Witcher merchandise, but also the WitcherCon on July 9th. As they say, it is a global celebration of The Witcher brought to us not only by Netflix, but also by none other than CD Projekt, the developers of the Witcher games. It will consist of 2 live streams with unique contents, and it dives deep into the making of the games. Live action series, anime films, and merchandise. Interactive panels with people from the show and the games talking about their work will feature breaking news and never-before-seen footage across the Witcher franchise. And of course, the Witcher lore, legends, monsters, and origins of the continents will play a big part too. Go to witchercon.com for the exact times and more information. In other news, we finally know more about the Witcher prequel anime movie Nightmare of the Wolf, about a young Vesemir. Kwang Il-han will direct the film. He is known for his work on titles like The Boondocks, Avatar The Last Airbender, or The Legends of Korra. In an interesting article on Variety.com, we also learn a little bit more about the movie's plot. Before Geralt came Vesemir, a headstrong young Witcher who relishes his job and the earthly benefits he reaps in doing what others can't or won't. Seemingly unshakable, Vesemir will face a crisis of conscience when a new power threatens the continent, forcing him to re-evaluate why he does the work he does. Witcher main showrunner Lauren Hissrich, who is a co-executive producer of the animated spin-off, talked about how Nightmare of the Wolf connects to the main show. She said, "Families are multi-generational. The things I teach my children I learned from the generation ahead of me. When we meet Geralt in The Witcher, he is a full adult. He's 100 years old and he's been living on his own for a very long time. But you can't help wondering how he learned the things he practices regularly and is going to teach Ciri." Nightmare of the Wolf writer Bo DeMaio adds, "It's gonna give fans that are familiar with the series a totally unique experience that I hope makes them feel like they're coming to The Witcher for the first time again. I'm also just excited for the fans to see the action. It's pretty awesome." Last but not least, we learned who will be in charge of the soundtrack for the other Witcher spin-off Blood Origin, the prequel miniseries about the continent's early history. Showrunner Declan Ibarra announced on Twitter that Bear McCreary will be the composer for the show. He is famous for his work on Battlestar Galactica, The Walking Dead, and Outlander, among others. Anyway guys, that's all for today. I hope you all stay safe and well. We talk again in the next episode of Breakfast in Beauclair. Until then, thanks again for listening and good luck on the path.
Hey everyone, welcome back from the break. When we left off, we discussed the relationship between factions on the continent, Triss's sickness, and her relationship with Geralt. Geralt, Triss, and Ciri end up at a fort that had been attacked by a band of Scoia'tael the previous evening. And so this fort, which would normally have no more than maybe a dozen people or a handful of people, is now buzzing with activity, as Geralt notes. They don't really know what happened. They go in. Geralt has a very sick sorceress, and they put her down with all the rest of the injured men, and Geralt starts to speak to some of the people in charge at this fort. So, as Leia said, this is the Fort of Exposition. Yeah, we just get a huge dump about everything that has happened on the continent since Geralt was holed up in Kaer Morhen over about 2 years. This is the first mention of the Scoia'tael, which is how one of the characters in the book defines them is as forest bands, and Scoia'tael in Elder speech means squirrel, and nobody knows exactly where the name came from, but ultimately it just means squirrels. And the Scoia'tael, if you play Gwent, they're familiar to you. They are armed bands of non-humans, typically. So elves, dwarves, mostly. I feel like halflings less often, but I know that a halfling appears in this chapter, and others. These Scoia'tael commandos over the last 2 years have been roaming around the lands and combating humans under the slogan of humans to the sea and death to humans. That's part of the exposition dump that we get here. Any thoughts on the introduction of the Scoia'tael?
It's an interesting choice to have the first introduction to them be from these guys who were attacked by them, right?
Okay.
I think, because there are ways in which the Scoia'tael can be, and I think later kind of are, sympathetic, in some respects. But to open with these guys who are like, who have just been attacked by, this kind of roving band of armed terrorists, it's interesting because it sets it off, really like putting their violence in the foreground.
Mm-hmm. And I think that definitely comes to the forefront of the conversation. We end up in the setting where, as you said, the attack had just happened. We hear about dead bodies. We hear about the injured. And then it gets into more explicit debate with the people who are here at the fort about why the Scoia'tael exist, what should be done about them, whether they should be rounded up and imprisoned, whether or not they should be trusted, can they be trusted? And it turns into still exposition, but more focused around how that situation can or should be handled. And there's opposition on all sides of this argument.
Yeah, I thought that the section with the Grieve and the tax collector and the different merchants and the knight, like all of those different characters, except for the knight, nobody seems to be like wholly on one side or the other. Like they're like, at least the other more peasant type characters are kind of debating, well, we used to go through this section of the woods or this area and we didn't need armies, it's y'all are the aggressors or blah, blah, blah. And then the knight's like, how dare you have sympathy for them? You're just a child, or, whatever he says. I just think it's interesting how they're all, again, just giving different exposition, different plot points of how some people are wholly against them because they just see them as outsiders and lesser and, whatever. And then there are the people who've lived amongst them and worked with them and are trying to be sympathetic, but are still frustrated by this turn of events. And, I think it's really apt of Sapkowski to have included these different viewpoints instead of just being like, oh, these elves attacked this fort and, like bad stuff happened and it caused inconvenience. He's giving us a view into how things are not straightforward in the Witcher world. They never are, especially when it comes to like the different races interacting. It's just really interesting. And it makes me have sympathy for them because at least coming from The Witcher 3, you wander around Novigrad or any of the major cities and the elves are kind of pushed to the outskirts or the less desirable locations of the town. So you are aware that even though the knight says, we treated them as equals, did you really? It's very applicable to like current events in our world, how people are like, oh, we treated them equally and now they're mad. Like, did you really though? Did you actually really try?
Yeah, and like the thing that came to mind for me when I was reading this part of the chapter, obviously all the things that are happening in the world right now, yes, 100%. And all of the characters in here are unnamed and are only described by their positions within the fort. And I believe it was the knight, or one of the knights, who had suggested like, oh no, we need to round up everybody. We need to round up everyone who's non-human, whether or not they're suspicious. Everyone's suspicious. We need to round up the men, women, children. The thing that came to mind for me specifically was the Japanese internment camps during World War II, where they just rounded up anyone who's Japanese, particularly on the West Coast. And again, this is me speaking as an Asian American woman, but there's just kind of so much happening right now in the world, coupled with, you know, that piece of history that come to mind and come to the surface when reading something like this. As you had said, Madi, like, there are multiple points of view here. It lays the groundwork for understanding that later, even with the non-human side, on the human side, not everyone believes in that singular approach. Not everyone believes that non-humans are inherently evil, and that there's nuance to each of the different viewpoints that are here. And I think it, as I said, primes us to see that on the other side later as well.
I appreciate that similar to the diarrhea thing, right? Like, this is another way that like these books tend to not gloss over the messiness of politics or of conflict. And like, so like even most of these like crummy dudes in this tent or fort or wherever they are, they have like some genuine grievances, right? Like, most of them aren't just spouting off purely because they're racists. You know, like, things are more difficult, and they were just attacked, and some people did die, and, you know, they're all frustrated and tense. And I appreciate that, like, in addition to it being a racial discussion, and this is a side note because I haven't, obviously, I don't read Polish, so I haven't read the Polish. But I appreciate that in the translation, the term that is used in English is racism, like throughout the books, when they're talking about the kind of prejudice against non-humans. Non-humans will call it racism within this universe. Humans will call it racism within this universe. And I appreciate that that's like, I assume, reflected, you know, in the original as well. That like, he's not precious about this. Like, you know, it's the same basic idea. And he's not trying to be cute. He's just like, no, it's the same thing. And I also love that so one thing that I took away, this is like a very stupid close reading, but like, they're arguing, the knight is saying like, look, the real problem is, you know, is collaborators, is non-human collaborators, right? Like, who live in our towns and who secretly pass money to these terrorists. There's this other guy who interrupts because the knight like calls out half elves. And Sapkowski says like, another merchant, slim, with a delicate and noble face, in no way a typical merchant's features.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that.
And when I read that, I was like, yo, is he a half elf? Like, is he like quarter elf? Like, because he doesn't say, you know, like that he looks like a half elf. And it's not like, it's not clear if having delicate features would signify that, like, necessarily in this world. You know, but he does place this sentiment. This guy's like, you know, there was a half elf assassinated, you know, in this other town because he wasn't sympathetic to this world. And it's interesting that he puts that sentiment into this character's mouth, and that he allows there to be like a real diversity of people here in Fort Exposition, so that Ciri can listen and then be ready for the next part of the chapter.
In regards to the half-elf that kind of piped up, or the possible half-elf that piped up in the middle, in the very first chapter of the book, when Dandelion is singing under the great tree, there is an entire discourse in which someone says, like, everybody has a little bit of elf in them, and the entire crowd of, like, 50 people goes quiet. So it's interesting to see, like, that same idea kind of come up here in another way.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And I think, you know, as much as this chapter is, like, very self-contained, you know, like, he's clearly carrying this theme through. And he has, I feel like this book in particular has like a lot of these like discussion scenes where you just kind of get to see how these people interact in a lot of different scenarios with all their differences intact.
Oh, yeah. And just the psychology of it is part of why I love it so much.
Mm-hmm.
I just love seeing how he crafts these different dialogues between all of these characters, and the way that he's able to like selectively pull out their differences into let the characters antagonize each other in a way that feels constructive in almost every scene.
Right.
So I really enjoy that, in that all of these dialogue scenes, yes, it's an exposition dump every time, but they do feel purposeful. And, for the most part throughout the series, a lot of them are very engaging. Not all of them, but most of them are very, very engaging.
It always moves the plot forward. I know in past episodes you say a lot that the plot is character driven. I think these dialogues, like you're saying, if anything, is super evident of that.
I appreciate you reminding me what I've said in past episodes because I don't always remember. After Geralt speaks to everyone in the fort, he's then called by the resident physician who's there, taking care of everybody, to come check on Triss. And, Maddie, you had a question about this specifically?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, one of my things loving plants so much is like, oh, what is this herb? Like, what is the actual use for it? Because a lot of times authors will actually put things in that are very much something realistic. Firewater, pepper, and saltpeter. First of all, that doesn't sound the most soothing if you've got stomach issues. But I wonder what those are. I know sometimes pepper, like cayenne pepper, can be like a pain reliever if you've got like a topical scratch. I know it sounds like very backwards to put it on there, but it soothes the pain. I think because it causes so much overload at first that then your body is just like, okay, we're not paying attention to this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But the firewater, I just think of like vodka. Is that vodka? I know a lot of older people just put alcohol on everything to try and make things better. But yeah, did you have more information about that?
I did just do a high-level Google search, and Firewater is a American band, and it is also and it also refers to high-proof beverages, particularly moonshine, and is also the name of polluted water remaining after firefighting. So in this context, it probably refers to high-proof beverages such as moonshine. I don't know if like moonshine with salt and pepper is going to do a ton, but this is why I prefer modern medicine.
Oh yeah.
It's definitely clear that like this doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And the impression that I got for sure is that this is just one of those kind of like, weird like purgative medicinal approaches where like he probably gives everyone with an internal ailment firewater with pepper and saltpeter.
Sometimes it works.
Yeah, exactly. If you've lost a limb, like then he does something else. But if it's inside you, he's just like, I don't know, this will probably kill it.
Like, yeah, sounds like bartender or grandmother's remedy,
exactly.
Like 100%.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, at this point, this man then tells Geralt that he's concerned that Triss might have, he doesn't know the word for dysentery, but he refers to it, that Triss might have dysentery that could spread around the entire fort. And Geralt, again, is very insistent that, like, no, it can't be. She's a sorceress. She's fine. The man responds, like, clearly your sorceress is in good health.
Yeah, they say yours, as I see, is just emanating good health.
Yeah.
Like, he's so sassy.
Yeah. So rude. And at this point, Geralt is like, we still need help. And it's either this man or I believe the knight who's there, who tells him there's a convoy that's currently heading south. You should catch up with them. It's almost dark. They'll definitely have to make camp. You'll catch up with them by morning. And Geralt asks, will I find help there? And the response is that, well, you're not going to find any here. Which is pretty brutal. But it gives us, again, a little bit more contrast when we actually meet that convoy. Before Geralt, Triss, and Ciri meet the convoy, we're going to end our discussion here. Join Leah, Maddie, and I in the next episode of Breakfast in Beauclair for our continued discussion of Andrzej Sapkowski's Blood of Elves, Chapter 4. Thanks for joining us at the breakfast table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and a complete list of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastinbeauclair.com. Breakfast in Beauclair is created by Alyssa from GoodMorhen, hosted by Alyssa with the Tidings Toussaint news sung by Alyssa from Flicks. The show is edited by Alyssa with music from Filter Media. Breakfast in Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Lucy Covey, the owner of the Churlish Porpoise, Eric Godlin, Katie, the redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B. Ava of Gullet B. Haven of the Edge of the World, Charlotte from Megaberg, Glamorai, Red Kite, the Virgin Roach, Ale Kitty, Dustin Libby, Clara Delja, and Neiman Dilovich, Brett from California, Wolf, Corey from the US, Jonathan Blee, and Sebastian von Novigrad. Special thanks to Leah and Maddie for joining us for this episode and our international Hanza for their support.